I think one of the most challenging things is to write only 150 words on a form of data and only be able to talk about the main features. And this is exactly what our students are being asked to do in task 1. But do you know what's even more difficult than that? Actually teaching them how to do it. Well, luckily enough, we're going to talk about that today. So let's get into it. Hi guys, my name is Phil and welcome to the channel. So when I first started teaching the IELTS, I did find task 1 quite challenging to teach. But then I started talking to colleagues and I just taught it to death, and now I know all the ins and outs of it. So I just want to share my ideas with you. So remember that the writing test in IELTS will be different based on whether the student's taking the academic test or the general test. So with the academic tests, they're going to be given some form of data and they have to summarize that data and select the main features and then talk about that. If they're doing the general test, they're going to be given a topic for a letter and then they're going to have to write a letter. And the thing that they're going to have to change there is the register. Could be a personal letter, it could be a very formal letter, and this is something that you need to teach them in class. So when it comes to the question types, task 1 is very varied for academic. You can have things from line graphs, bar charts, pie charts, maps, process diagrams, and you could even have multiple different types of data together, so pie charts and line graphs and tables as well. So it's really different, and you've got to teach the students how to approach each of those things because they will demand slightly different skills. For the general, it's going to be, as I said, a letter, and it's really teaching them when to use the right kind of register for a personal letter, for a personal situation, for a semi-formal situation and a formal situation. Now, I'm going to concentrate more on the academic in this video, purely because in my experience, more students go through that, more students are going to come into your classroom wanting to study this. Now, this is not to say that I won't cover the general test at all on this channel, but I'm just going to concentrate on academic a little bit more today. So when it comes to the data, there's a real distinction that you need to teach your students, and that's between static data, data based on one period of time, or what I call dynamic data, or change over time. Because if it's static or if it's dynamic, they're going to need to use slightly different grammar, slightly different vocabulary. So for static data, it's more about comparisons and things like this, whereas with the change over time data, they're going to really have to use words to talk about trends and how the trends change. So it's really important that you bring these two elements into your classroom so that they can do both, because they never know what kind of task 1 they're going to get in the exam. So if we just talk about the overall structure of a task 1, the first sentence, so we can call it the introduction or the introductory sentence, is always the same for every single question type. In this sentence, the student has to introduce the data. They have to introduce what the context is. So for example, this graph shows the increase in car sales in 5 different European countries between 1960 and 2020. Something like this. Now the examiner knows the context, we can move on to the second part. The second part is kind of part of the introduction, or it could be a separate paragraph. It's the overview. Now, it's possible to put the overview at the end of the report, but I always teach my students to put it right at the beginning because, for one thing, if they forget to give an overview, they cannot get a higher than band score 5 in the task achievement. And also, if you put it nice and early in the report, it's unlikely that they're going to forget it. So this is what I teach them. The overview is the big picture, the major trends, okay? You should not teach your students to go into detail here. They shouldn't be including the data or anything like that, really. It's just the picture. So I would say something like, overall, the number of sales in all 5 countries increased over the period. That's an overview. Then after that, you're probably going to have to write about 2 paragraphs. Remember, you have to write a minimum of 150 words. It doesn't sound like a lot, but for most students, that's going to take them the best part of 20 minutes. So 2 paragraphs is more than possible. And within those paragraphs, I like to think of it in this terms. So the first sentence in the paragraph, as always, is going to be a topic sentence, right? But if you treat it as a mini overview, so what you're doing is picking out particular trends or main features from the graph, and within that sentence, you're giving a mini overview of what happened for those particular trends. And then in the following sentences, the supporting sentences, the student has to provide evidence for it. So this is where they put the data. This is where they make the comparisons, hopefully by grouping data together. And if you have 2 paragraphs like that, then it makes it really easy to understand the data, and they're going to get a lot of good points because they're going to, so for the CC, the cohesion and coherency, they're going to really link ideas together. They're also going to be comparing things. So this is what they should be doing, but many students don't. So let's talk about the biggest mistakes that students make when they approach the academic task 1. Well, the first thing they do is they list the data. They tell the examiner everything. Now, I always say to my students, if the examiner could draw a perfect line graph or the perfect bar chart from reading your report and get every single detail correct, you're probably going to get a very low band score because you're asked to select the main features. So listing data is not good. They need to learn how to group data together, how to compare it, and not just write it out as they see it. The other big mistake is that they don't include any data at all. Now, of course, there are many different ways to talk about numbers, but they must include figures in some capacity in order to get a higher than about band score 5 in task achievement. But you can also teach your students how to talk about data in an interesting way, and we'll talk about that in a moment. Another big issue is actually not comparing the data at all, making no comparisons at any point. This is something that they are asked to do in the instructions, so you need to teach them how to do this. And another problem, and it's not really a mistake as such, but it's using the wrong sentence frames. Students find it tricky to talk about data, and they just explain it in the wrong way. Now, if you aren't familiar with the term sentence frame, this is basically a structure that the students learn. They may not be able to produce it by heart, but they learn it, and they're able to adapt it by changing certain words or adapting the grammar to fit many different situations. It's almost like, I don't know if you're a coder, but in coding it's like a function. It works for every situation, you're just changing the variables. So by teaching them the right sentence frames for certain situations, especially for describing data, in pie charts, for example, because there are only certain ways to do it, right, in English. By teaching them the right sentence frames, they're going to be able to talk about many different things. It's going to appear to the examiner that they've got a better grasp of English than perhaps they do. So by teaching them sentence frames, you're really going to be helping them out. So this brings me on to the 3 cardinal sins of task 1 in the academic paper. The first thing that students do is to write their opinions about the data. They are not asked to do this. They should not be writing anything to do with opinions. The next thing they do, which again they shouldn't be doing, is to explain why the data changes or why things happen. Again, they're not asked to do this. And the third thing I've seen, which is a terrible sin, is writing a conclusion. After they've written their report, they summarize everything. They're not asked to do this. Now, my colleague Michael, and we've actually got another YouTube channel called the IELTS Grind, and we use this to actually teach students how to pass the IELTS exam. Now, he's come up with a great little phrase, a saying for students to help them remember, and you can absolutely steal this. It's no I, no why, and no conclusion. So tell them not to put their opinions, not to explain why data changes, only to report how it changes, and definitely no conclusions. The reason there's no conclusion is because there's no thesis, there's no opinion. So if you teach your students not to do all these things, you're going to really be helping them out. So if I was teaching task 1 for the first time, this is what I would do. I would concentrate on giving the students certain structures, certain sentence frames that they can repurpose for many different types of chart, many different types of data sets in order to describe the data well. So teaching good sentence frames is really going to help your students out. Another thing is helping them to select data. Now, it's kind of tricky even for us native speakers. What we're trying to look for is the most interesting data. So it's often the biggest numbers or the biggest changes, the smallest numbers, the smallest changes, the data that was the highest or lowest, or things that behaved in the same way, or things that happened in an opposite fashion to the other trends. These are the kind of things that we should be focusing on. And it's your job to help them identify them and then show them ways that they can compare them, to group them in order to really explain it well in a limited amount of words. And a really helpful thing for task 1, especially for the academic paper, is giving them lots of different ways to talk about figures. So instead of teaching them just, for example, the price of coffee was $10 in 2015 and in 2020 it was $40, we could say that in 2020 the price of coffee had gone up 4 times or had increased 4-fold. Or even things like if we compare the price of coffee from 2020 to 2015, 2015 the price of coffee was only a quarter of what it was in 2020. So interesting ways to talk about that, lots of different ways to talk about the same numbers. This is really going to help your students not to repeat themselves too much, and they're going to get a much better score in the IELTS. Okay guys, so that was task 1 for writing. I've also got many other videos about all different aspects of the IELTS test. So why not subscribe to the channel, give me a like, and if you've got any comments at all, anything that you would like me to cover, or perhaps any tips that you would give to other teachers, we're all here to learn together, so let's help each other out. Okay guys, I'll see you in the next video. Bye bye.